The radio hissed once, then went silent, and silence in that place was a kind of death. Captain Reed Sutton pressed his spine into the cold limestone and felt the mountain shudder as rounds chewed the rock a hand span above his helmet. Grit rained down the back of his collar. His ears rang. Somewhere below him, in the throat of the canyon, a man was screaming, and the sound did not belong to any training exercise Reed had ever run. 12 men. That was the whole of it. 12 United States Army Special Forces soldiers strung across 40 meters of frozen scree in a gorge the maps called Gallows Reach, a 2-mile scar of granite and river ice carved into the eastern flank of the Absaroka Range in Montana. High country, empty country, the kind of ground where the wind moved like something alive and the cold got into your chest and stayed there. It was supposed to be a range. It was supposed to be safe. They had come here for a culminating live fire. Exercise Granite Watch, the last graded event before the detachment rotated home. A clean problem on a clean range. Move through the gorge, service the target array, exfil to the rally point, shake hands with the observers and go get a hot meal. Blank adapters on some weapons. Controlled live rounds on others. Safety officers on every corner. A civilian contractor playing the role of the enemy, wearing red vests so nobody could mistake a friend for a foe. Reed was learning, in the worst way a man can learn a thing, that the red vests had been lying. Because the rounds coming down on his team were not blanks. They were not simulation. He had seen Sergeant First Class Vic Delgado take a burst across the chest plate and go down hard behind a boulder. And when Delgado came up again, he was bleeding from a seam in the armor, real blood, dark and fast, freezing on the stone. He had heard the snap of supersonic rounds passing his cheek, that flat, vicious crack that no blank in the world could fake. He had smelled the copper of it and the burnt powder, and under all of it the sour animal smell of men who understood they were being killed. Contact left, Delgado had called, and then the radio ate his voice. Reed keyed his own handset. Nothing. Dead air. He looked at the little screen and it was dark. He looked up at the canyon walls, at the way they leaned in overhead like the closing jaws of something patient, and he understood that the mountain itself was against him. Granite blocks a signal. Deep gorges swallow it whole. Whoever had chosen this ground had chosen it for exactly that reason. There would be no call for help. There would be no medevac birds slicing over the ridgeline. There would be only the 12 of them and the guns above, and the guns above had numbers. He counted muzzle flashes the way his father had taught him to count them, quick and cold, 1 heartbeat each. 10, 20. He lost the thread somewhere past 40. Fire teams, overlapping lanes, men bounding from cover to cover along the high shoulders of the gorge with a discipline no bored contractor ever showed. This was not a role player earning a paycheck. This was a hunting party. 50 guns, maybe more, and every one of them was pointed at the floor of Gallows Reach with a single simple purpose written across it. And the purpose was that no one walked out. Sergeant First Class Camilla Ortega crawled up beside him on her elbows, her face gray with rock dust, her rifle cradled across her forearms. She had been his intelligence sergeant for 2 deployments and she did not rattle. She was rattled now. He could see it in the tightness around her eyes. "They are shooting live," she said. Her voice was flat and low. "Sir, they are shooting live and they are not stopping." "I know," Reed said. "The evaluators are gone." I looked. "The red vests pulled off the rim 10 minutes ago. Then the ones that stayed put their weapons on us." "I know," he said again, because there was nothing else true to say. He risked a look over the lip of stone. Down the gorge, back toward the mouth they had entered through, 3 figures in tan were moving through the dry wash with the loose, easy lope of men who did this for a living, cutting off the only clean route home. To the north, the canyon narrowed and climbed into broken country. No cover, no support, just open ground and the thin hope of the high pines 1,000 meters up. To the east and west, the walls rose sheer and hostile and full of guns. 3 sides sealed. The fourth a suicide sprint. Reed did the arithmetic the way a commander has to do it, fast, without letting his own heart into the number, and the number came up the same each time he ran it. They were going to die in this gorge, all 12 of them, and no one would ever quite be able to explain how a training accident had killed an entire detachment on an American range. Then through the roar, a single rifle crack split the air, and it did not sound like the others. It came from above and behind, from somewhere on the eastern wall where there should have been nothing but wind. It was clean. It was singular. It landed in the middle of the chaos like a period at the end of a sentence, and one of the tan figures moving up the wash simply stopped, folded, and did not move again. Reed felt Ortega go still beside him. The rifle spoke a second time. Another man dropped, high on the western shoulder, one of the shooters who had been raking the team with a belt-fed gun. The gun went quiet. A third crack, and a third man fell, and now something changed in the texture of the ambush. A hitch, a hesitation, the sound of a machine that had just felt a gear break somewhere deep inside it. Reed stared at the eastern wall. He saw nothing. No silhouette against the pale sky. No muzzle flash winking from the rocks. No dust kicked up by a bipod, no glint of glass, no shape a trained eye could name. Just stone and snow and the indifferent blue of high-altitude morning. And yet the rifle kept talking, unhurried, spaced out, each report arriving exactly when the last echo died, and every time it spoke a man on the high ground stopped being a threat. "Who is that?" Ortega breathed. "Sir, who is that?" Reed did not answer, because he did not know, and because the not knowing had opened a small cold door in the back of his mind that he could not yet close. The enemy fire faltered. For the first time since the trap had sprung, the volume of it dropped, the shooters on the walls pulling their heads down, turning, searching for the thing that was killing them from a direction they could not find. Reed had felt the weight of 50 guns pressing his team into the dirt, and now he felt that weight lift by a fraction, by a breath, and a breath was all a good officer needed. "Delgado," he shouted. The weapons sergeant lifted his head from behind the boulder, jaw set, blood black on his shoulder. "On me," Reed called. "Rally north. Bounding teams. We move on my mark, and we do not stop for anything that is not a wounded American." "Roger," Delgado said, and passed it down the line, and Reed heard the word ripple through his men, north, 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 the single syllable of it carrying a thing that had been missing 30 seconds ago, which was the possibility of living. He looked at Ortega. "Take point," he said. "Find me the seam." She was already moving. What Reed Sutton did not know, could not have known, crouched there in the cold with his dead radio and his bleeding men, was that 400 meters up the eastern wall, tucked into a fold of granite that no aerial photograph would ever have flagged as a firing position, an old man lay behind a long rifle and worked the bolt with 2 fingers as gently as a man turning the page of a book he loved. He was 67 years old. His beard was the color of wood ash. His hands did not shake, though they had every reason to after all the years and all the cold, and his eye at the scope was the pale, washed gray of a winter sky. He wore a ghillie suit on the exact dead brown of the winter grass, and he had lain in that fold of rock without moving for 3 hours before the first shot was fired, because he had known the first shot was coming. He had known a great many things that morning that no living soul had told him. His rifle was a Mark 22, chambered in a cartridge that could reach past a mile and arrive with murder still in it, and he handled it the way other men handle the memory of a woman they lost young. He did not aim so much as remember where the target already was. He read the wind by the way the snow devils turned in the gorge below, by the lean of a single dead pine on the far rim, by a lifetime of mornings exactly like this one. and he made his corrections in his head without a computer, without a ballistic solver, without anything but the arithmetic that had lived in his bones for 4 decades. He found the man on the western shoulder who was trying to rally the others, the one gesturing, the one whose mouth was moving with commands, and he settled the reticle on him and let out half a breath and did not finish it. The old man did not think of the shot as killing. He had stopped thinking of it that way a long time ago. He thought of it as keeping a promise. He thought, as he pressed the trigger, of a name he had not said out loud in 25 years, and then the rifle bucked into his shoulder, and the man with the moving mouth went down, and the promise held for 1 more minute. Somewhere in the mountain wind, a scent reached him, faint, carried up the thermal off the canyon floor. Cordite, burnt powder and hot brass and the iron tang of opened men. And for the length of a single heartbeat, the old man was not in Montana at all. He was somewhere else, somewhere hot and pale and long ago, lying behind a different rifle in a different waste of stone, and a voice he had loved better than his own was saying something to him through the smoke, something he had spent his whole life trying to earn the right to hear. Then the heartbeat passed. The cordite was only cordite. He worked the bolt. He found the next man. He kept the watch. Down on the floor of Gallows Reach, the detachment surged north. They moved the way they had trained 10,000 times, the way that lives in the body below thought, 2 men up and moving while 2 men behind them poured fire into the walls. Then the pairs trading, leapfrogging, a thing that would have looked almost beautiful to anyone who did not understand that every rush crossed open ground under the eyes of guns. Ortega led. She found the seam Reed had asked for, a diagonal run of dead space, where the geometry of the walls left a wedge the shooters could not quite reach, and she poured herself into it, and the team poured after her. They did not make it clean. War does not let you make it clean, and this was war now, whatever the paperwork would later call it. A young sergeant named Owen Pratt, the communications man, took a round through the meat of his thigh and went down mid-stride, and the soldier behind him, a 22-year-old specialist named Jonah Teague, grabbed the drag handle on the back of Pratt's kit and hauled him bodily across the open, screaming with the effort, rounds walking up the dirt behind his boots, and somehow the two of them tumbled into cover alive. Teague was the youngest man there. He had come to Blackburn as a sniper student, attached to the detachment for the exercise to log time behind glass, a quiet kid from a small town who flinched at loud tables in the chow hall and had never in his life heard a round fired at him in anger. He would remember this morning until the day he died. He would remember the weight of Owen Pratt on the end of his arm, and the smell of the man's blood, and the strange, impossible metronome of that rifle up on the wall, the one that kept the killers looking the wrong way just long enough. And he would spend years trying to describe to people who had not been there what it felt like to be saved by a ghost. Because that was what it felt like. Every man in the gorge felt it. There was a shooter up there in the rocks, and no one had put him there. No one commanded him. No one knew his call sign or his face. And yet he moved his fire across the battle like a conductor moving a baton, and where his attention fell the enemy died, and the detachment lived in the gaps he opened. Up in the tan and the red, a man named Royce Talon was beginning to understand that his morning had gone very wrong. Talon was 44 years old, and he had been, in another life, one of the finest precision shooters the Army had ever trained, before the Army decided it no longer wanted him, and he decided he no longer wanted it. He wore the tan of the contractor element that had staged this thing, and he lay in a good hide of his own high on the northern lip of the gorge with a rifle the twin of the Ghost's, and he had been told a simple thing. He had been told that this would be an execution, not a fight. He had been told that 12 tired soldiers would walk into a bag, and the bag would close, and by noon there would be 12 names for the accident board, and a story about a range gone tragic. He had been paid a great deal of money to make sure the story ended the way it was supposed to end. Now his shooters were dropping, and no one could find the gun that was dropping them. And Royce Talon, who had spent a career learning the language of rifles, lay behind his scope and listened. And what he heard turned the skin on the back of his neck to goose flesh. He knew that rhythm. Not the man. The rhythm. The spacing of the shots, the way the shooter took the officer first and the machine gunner second and the radio man third, the way he never fired twice at a target already falling, the way he seemed to shoot at where a man was going to be rather than where he was. It was old school. It was a doctrine Talon had heard described once by an instructor long retired, described almost with fear, a way of fighting that belonged to a generation of shooters who had done their work before satellites and before solvers, who had carried the whole science of the thing in their heads. "There is a ghost," one of Talon's men said over the net, his voice cracking. "There is a ghost on the east wall and I cannot see him and he is killing us." "Shut up," Talon said. He scanned the eastern wall through his glass, inch by inch, fold by fold, everything he knew about hiding a man in high country pouring through his mind, and he found nothing. Nothing. The wall gave him back stone and snow and the small mocking shape of a single dead pine, and no matter how he looked, the gun that was murdering his operation refused to exist. "Who are you?" Royce Talon whispered to the mountain. The mountain did not answer. But down below, the detachment reached the narrow throat where Gallows Reach pinched to a slot barely 3 men wide, a natural choke point, a place a small unit could hold, and Reed Sutton threw them into it and turned to count his people. And while he counted, the ghost on the wall fired 4 more times, fast now, and 4 more of Talon's men went into the snow, and the pursuit that had been forming behind the detachment came apart like wet paper. "Hold here," Reed said. "Interlocking sectors. Delgado left, Ortega right. Doc, get to Pratt." The team folded into the rocks, chests heaving, weapons up. Doc Ramsey slid in beside Owen Pratt and had a tourniquet on the leg before Pratt finished cursing. Somewhere out beyond the choke point the enemy fire dwindled, then guttered, then stopped, and into the ringing quiet came only the wind and the small terrible sounds of the wounded and the slow drip of blood freezing on stone. Reed counted 11. His stomach dropped through the floor of him. He counted again, slower, touching each man with his eyes. Delgado, Ortega, Ramsey, Pratt, Teague, Corbin, down the line. 11. "Where is Foss?" he said. No one answered. Then Corbin, the engineer, breathing hard, would not meet his eyes. "He was in the last position," Corbin said, "back at the first wall. He was laying down fire so we could move. I did not see him come out." Reed closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. In that second he was aware of every choice he had made in the last 20 minutes and the price of each one, and he made himself set the weight of it down, because a commander who carries the dead into the next decision gets the living killed. He opened his eyes. "We hold," he said. "We hold and we account for our people and we find a way to raise higher command, and then we go back for Foss if there is anything to go back for. Ortega, that signal, I need it." "Working on it, sir," she said, though the mountain around them was a wall of granite and the odds of punching a transmission through it were long. And that was when Reed noticed the quiet on the walls was total. Not suppressed, not hesitating. Gone. The enemy had broken contact. 50 guns had risen out of the gorge and melted back into the high country like smoke drawn up a flue, dragging their wounded, abandoning the killing they had been paid to finish. And in the whole 2-mile length of Gallows Reach nothing moved but the wind and 11 exhausted Americans and the slow red seep of the men who had almost not made it. They had come to kill everyone, and someone had made them run. Reed keyed his dead radio out of pure animal habit, got nothing, lowered it. He looked up at the eastern wall where the impossible rifle had been, and he found himself walking toward the base of it before he had decided to walk, Ortega falling in behind him without a word, both of them moving on legs that did not quite belong to them yet. It took them a long time to climb. The eastern wall was worse than it had looked from below, a broken staircase of ledges and frost-slick granite, and twice Reed nearly went off it, and the whole time he climbed he told himself he did not know what he expected to find, and the whole time he knew he was lying. He expected to find a man. He needed to find a man. Because a man he could thank, a man he could name, a man he could put in a report, and the alternative, the thing crouching at the edge of his mind, was that there had been no man at all, and Reed Sutton was not ready to live in a world where an entire detachment had been saved by nothing. They reached the fold in the rock as the sun cleared the far rim and poured thin gold light down into the gorge. It was a perfect position. Reed saw that at once, with the part of him his father had trained. Perfect sight lines the length of the canyon. Perfect concealment, tucked so that no shape broke the skyline, no shadow fell wrong. A shooter could have held the whole of Gallows Reach from here and never once been seen. Reed had walked ranges his entire adult life, and he had rarely stood in a place so exactly, so lovingly chosen. And it was empty. Whoever had lain here was gone. There were no boot prints in the thin snow, or rather there were, and they had been brushed out, deliberately, patiently, by a hand that knew how tracks are read and refused to leave any. There was no brass scattered on the rock, because the shooter had policed his own casings, all but one. Ortega found it. She crouched and lifted it with 2 fingers and held it up to the light, and Reed took it from her, and the two of them looked at it the way you look at a thing that should not be. It was a spent cartridge, long, machined, heavy in the hand, the case of a match-grade round built to reach across a mountain and still kill. Reed turned it in his fingers and felt the cold of it and could not make it mean what he needed it to mean, which was that everything had a simple explanation. And there was one more thing. It sat on a flat shelf of stone at the center of the position, set down carefully, placed where the first person to find the hide could not miss it. A coin. A challenge coin, old, the kind soldiers carry and trade and press into each other's palms at the end of hard things. The metal was worn smooth at the edges from years of handling. Reed picked it up. On one face was an emblem he did not recognize, a design half rubbed away by decades of thumbs. He turned it over. On the back, engraved in small, deliberate letters that someone had cut by hand a long time ago, were 4 words. "The watch still holds." Reed Sutton stood on the eastern wall of Gallows Reach with the coin in one hand and the spent cartridge in the other, and felt the cold door in the back of his mind swing fully open, because he had seen that phrase before. He had seen it in a place he had spent his whole life trying not to think about. He had seen it written in the same spare hand, in the margin of a weathered green notebook that had come home to a 9-year-old boy in a footlocker with his father's name stenciled on the lid. A footlocker Reed still had. A notebook Reed could recite from memory. A notebook full of wind and drop, and the private religion of a man who reads the ground for a living. He did not have time to fall into that thought, because below them, down on the canyon floor, the world had begun to fill up with the wrong kind of noise. Helicopters. Real ones now, the deep chop of rotors coming up the valley and vehicles grinding in through the mouth of the gorge, and men in clean uniforms fanning out across the ground where dirty men had just finished dying. The response had come at last, now that the killing was over, now that it was safe. Reed watched a knot of officers step down from the lead aircraft, and even at that distance, even without knowing yet who he was, Reed's eye went to one of them and stayed there. He was a big man gone heavy with age and rank, silver-haired, moving through the wreckage of the morning with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never in his life been told to wait. He wore civilian clothes cut to look like they were trying not to be noticed, and he was not noticed, except that everyone in a uniform bent slightly toward him as he passed, the way grass bends toward a heavy wind. Reed did not know his name. He would learn it soon enough. Colonel Coleman Ordway, retired, a man of enormous quiet influence and a great many titles, present that morning at Blackpine as a distinguished visitor and observer here, the paperwork would say, entirely by coincidence. Reed and Ortega came down off the wall slower than they had gone up it, and by the time they reached the canyon floor, the machinery of official response had swallowed the battlefield whole. Medics worked the wounded. A quick reaction force strung a perimeter. And the silver-haired man stood at the center of it all with a small tablet in his hand and a face like a closed door. And when Reed approached, filthy, bleeding at the hairline, still holding the coin in his fist, the man looked at him with mild grandfatherly concern and asked him for his account. Reed gave it. He gave it straight and hard, the way you brief a superior, the ambush, the live rounds, the walls, the numbers. 50 hostiles, he said, maybe more. Coordinated. This was not an exercise gone wrong. This was a killing, sir, and it was set up to look like a range accident. The silver-haired man nodded slowly, as if Reed had said something reasonable and sad. And how, he asked, his voice warm and low and terrible in its gentleness, did 11 of you survive an ambush of 50 guns in a boxed canyon with no communications and no air support? Reed hesitated. He felt Ortega go rigid at his shoulder. There was a shooter, Reed said, on the east wall. One man. He engaged from the high ground and he broke their assault. Without him we would all be dead, all of us. The silver-haired man was quiet for a moment. His pale eyes moved over Reed's face with an attention that did not match his easy voice, an attention that weighed and measured and filed something away. There was no additional shooter, he said at last. Sir, Reed said, I saw the effect of his fire. I climbed to his position. I recovered his brass. You recovered a spent cartridge on a live fire range, the man said, still gentle, still kind. Captain, this ground has been shot over for 40 years. You climbed a cliff in shock after a traumatic event, and you found what 100 exercises have left behind. He let that sit. There was no third party in this sector. There was no unknown shooter. What there was a catastrophic failure of a contracted opposing force element that I intend to see investigated to its roots. That is the story because that is the truth. Do you understand me? It was not a question, and every man who has ever worn the uniform knows the exact weight of a sentence shaped like that one. Reed felt the coin bite into his palm where his fist had closed around it without his permission. Yes, sir, he said. Good, the silver-haired man said, and the warmth came back into his face like a light switched on. You held that gorge, son. You brought your people out. That is what today will be remembered for. He almost smiled. Get your wounds looked at. He turned away, and as he turned, Reed heard him speak quietly to an aide, and the words were ordinary and administrative, and they froze the blood in Reed Sutton's body. Make sure, the man said, that no reference to any unidentified friendly element makes it into the initial report. Loose talk like that helps no one. Strike it at the source. Then he was gone, folded back into the crowd of clean uniforms, and Reed stood alone in the churned snow of Gallows Reach with the wind pulling at his torn collar, and he opened his fist and looked down at the worn coin lying in his bloody palm. The watch still holds. He thought of the green notebook in the footlocker with his father's name on the lid. He thought of the impossible spacing of those shots, officer first, gunner second, the old fighting done with nothing but the arithmetic a man carries in his bones. He thought of the way the ghost had seemed to shoot at where a man was going to be rather than where he was, and he heard, from somewhere very deep, his father's voice from 100 lessons on 100 cold mornings. A boy of 8 or 9 lying in the grass beside a big quiet man who smelled of gun oil and coffee, and the big man saying, low and patient, "You do not shoot the man, Reed. You shoot the future. You send the round to meet him where he has not gotten to yet." His father had been dead for 25 years. Killed on a range, they had told his mother. A training accident overseas, the details classified, the casket closed. Reed Sutton closed his hand around the coin and looked up at the empty eastern wall, at the fold of granite where no man had ever officially been, and he understood two things at once, and both of them changed the shape of his life. The first was that a stranger had walked into a slaughter meant for Reed and his men and had, for reasons Reed could not begin to fathom, spent that terrible skill to carry all of them out alive. The second was worse, and it lodged in his chest like a round that does not exit, and he would not be able to breathe around it for a long time. Whoever the ghost on the wall was, he had not learned to shoot like Reed's father. He had taught Reed's father to shoot. He had taught Reed's father to shoot, and Reed Sutton carried that impossible sentence down off the mountain, and it did not get lighter the lower he went. By the time the light failed over the Absarokas, the whole of Blackpine had folded shut around the incident like a fist. The gorge was a crime scene now, or would have been, if anyone with the authority to say the word crime had been willing to say it. Instead, there were quiet men with clean boots and laminated badges, and there were tarps over the places where the dead had lain, and there was a phrase moving through the cantonment from mouth to mouth: catastrophic contractor failure, tragic, under investigation, and every time Reed heard it the phrase had smoothed a little more, worn a little rounder, the way a lie does when enough careful hands pass it along. They put the survivors in a plywood barracks near the arms room and told them to rest and posted a soldier at the door who was not, Reed understood, entirely there for their comfort. Owen Pratt went out on the first medevac with the tourniquet still on his leg, cursing the whole way, alive. The others sat on their bunks and cleaned rifles nobody would let them load and did not talk much. Doc Ramsey moved among them checking pupils and bandaging the small wounds none of them had noticed taking. Vic Delgado sat with his back to the wall and his ruined chest played across his knees and stared at the frozen blood on it, as if it were a language he was trying to read. Jonah Teague, the youngest, the sniper student, sat apart with his knees drawn up and would not stop shaking, and Reed went and sat beside him and did not say anything wise because there was nothing wise to say. After a while the boy spoke. "I heard him," Teague said, "up on the wall, the way he shot. He looked at Reed with eyes too old for the morning. That was not luck, sir. That was somebody who has done that 1,000 times." "I know," Reed said. "Who saves 12 strangers," Teague said, and then just walks away. Reed had no answer for that either, and the not having of it sat in his chest beside the coin, which he had not been able to make himself put down. The metal had gone warm from his hand. The watch still holds. He turned it over and over while the barracks breathed around him, and every time his thumb crossed the worn emblem on the face he felt the past reach up through 25 years and take hold of his ankle. Camilla Ortega found him near midnight, standing alone at the frosted window watching the storm come. It was a big one, building black over the western peaks, the kind of Montana weather that shuts a mountain down for days. Reed could feel the pressure of it in his sinuses. Snow soon, and a lot of it, and wind to drive it sideways, and Reed stood watching the first ragged clouds swallow the stars and did not hear Ortega until she was at his shoulder. "Sir," she said low, "I need 5 minutes where the walls do not." He looked at her. Whatever was in her face pulled him out of his own head at once. They stepped into the cold arms room passage where the generator hum would eat their voices, and she stood close, and she told him a thing that turned the whole morning inside out. 3 days ago, Ortega said, before we ever staged for Granite Watch. I was reconciling the ammunition draw for the exercise. Standard inventory, lot numbers against the manifest. She swallowed. Sir, the numbers did not close. There was a lot of Mark 22 match grade, the good long-range stuff, and a pallet of M2010 components, logged into the range supply point and logged back out again, and the serial ranges did not match the paperwork on either end. Quantities were off. Somebody had moved product through this range and papered over the gap with a manifest that only works if you do not actually count. Reed stood very still. I flagged it, Ortega said, 3 days ago. I filed a discrepancy report through the range control channel because that is what you are supposed to do. She was not shaking, but her voice had gone thin as wire. And then this morning somebody put 50 guns into a box canyon and turned our graded exercise into a firing squad. She looked up at him. Sir, it was not random. We did not stumble into an ambush. We were the loose thread. Somebody decided the cheapest way to close a discrepancy report was to bury the sergeant who wrote it under an accident. Nobody would ever be allowed to investigate. The passage was cold, and the generator hummed, and Reed Sutton felt the last comfortable explanation die in his chest. They tried to erase you, he said, and when the report existed anyway, they tried to erase all of us. They almost did, Ortega said. We are only alive because of a man who does not exist. Reed made her prove it. He had to. He walked her back into the little range control annex where the terminals sat, and he stood over her shoulder while she logged in and pulled the channel where her discrepancy report had lived for 3 days, and the two of them looked at the screen for a long time without speaking. The report was gone, not archived, not flagged. Gone, the way a thing is gone when a careful hand has reached in and removed it and smoothed the record shut behind it, so the gap does not show unless you already know the shape of what used to be there. Ortega scrolled, and her jaw set harder with every empty line. Somebody deleted it tonight, she said quietly, while we were sitting on those bunks being told to rest. She looked up at him and her eyes were very steady and very afraid. Sir, they are not finished. They cleaned the paperwork first because the paperwork is what convicts them. We are just the last loose end that can still talk. Reed looked at the empty screen and understood that the fist around Blackpine had fingers inside the wire, at a keyboard, a room away from where his exhausted men were sleeping, and that whoever owned those fingers had already decided how this ended. 200 meters away, in a warm office that had been an evaluation cell that morning and was something else now, the silver-haired man read a single sheet of paper and set it down with great care. Coleman Ordway had spent 30 years learning that the most dangerous thing in the world is a soldier who writes things down. He held the printed discrepancy report between 2 fingers and read the name at the bottom of it, Sergeant First Class C. Ortega, and he felt the old cold competence settle over him the way it always had, the way it had in a hot, pale country a lifetime ago, when a young officer had first learned exactly how much a war will forgive if the paperwork is clean. He did not feel guilt. He had burned that particular nerve out of himself before this captain was born. He felt only the arithmetic, the same arithmetic he had run that morning and every consequential morning of his life, the weighing of one small life against a very large amount of money, and the answer came up the way it always came up. He picked up a secure phone and made a short call and said only a few words, and the words were about weather, and about opportunity, and about how a mountain closing under a storm is the most natural place in the world for a grieving detachment to suffer one more terrible accident before the roads reopen. Then he set the phone down and looked out his own window at the coming dark, and for one moment, one only, something moved behind his pale eyes, because a report from the gorge had crossed his desk an hour earlier that he had ordered struck from the record. A report about an unidentified shooter on the east wall who fought in a way that no one alive was supposed to fight anymore. There was no additional shooter, Ordway had said, and he had needed it to be true more than he had needed anything in a long time. Down the hall, a woman in a range safety vest watched him through the narrow window of the door and did not let her face show anything at all. Her badge said she was a contracted safety evaluator named M. Quist, and that was true as far as it went, and it did not go very far. She had been at Blackburn for 4 months, and she had been reconciling the same numbers Camilla Ortega had reconciled, only slower and quieter, and with a great deal more behind her, and she had come within days of having enough. She watched Coleman Ordway make his phone call, and she read the shape of it in the set of his shoulders, and she understood that days were exactly what she no longer had. Reed did not sleep. Near 2 in the morning, with the storm beginning to hiss against the barrack's skin, he could not stand the plywood box any longer, and he pulled on his cold weather gear and told the soldier at the door he needed air, and the soldier, young and unsure of his real orders, let him pass. The cold outside was enormous and clean. Snow was coming down now in earnest, fat and silent, and the cantonment lights hung in the falling white like drowned lamps. Reed walked the plowed track toward the range line because he did not know where else to put his body, and the coin was in his fist, and his father's voice was in his ears, and he was so deep inside the past that he was nearly to the tree line before he understood that he was not alone. The voice came out of the dark to his left, low and even and unhurried, a voice worn smooth as old leather. "You should not be out here, Captain," it said. "Neither of us should." Reed froze. His hand went to a sidearm he was not carrying. Out of the falling snow, from the black edge of the pines, a shape resolved itself, a big still shape that had been there the whole time and that Reed had walked right past, and he understood with a jolt that ran to the soles of his feet that he was standing 3 steps from the ghost of Gallows Reach. The old man did not look like much. That was the first thing. 67 years old, gone lean and gray, a beard the color of ash, a face weathered into a country of its own by a lifetime of cold mornings. He wore civilian winter gear that made no sound and caught no light. But his eyes, when they found Reed's in the dark, were the pale washed gray Reed had felt on the back of his neck all morning, and his stillness was the stillness of a man who had spent his whole life learning to be somewhere without being seen. "You," Reed said. "It was not a question." "Me," the old man agreed. "Who are you?" The old man was quiet for a moment, and the snow fell between them, and when he spoke his voice had something in it that Reed would not be able to name until much later, a kind of grief so old it had turned to stone. "I have gone by a lot of things," he said. "A long time ago they called me by a name. For the last 25 years the only word for me that has been true is a call sign, and the call sign is Warden." He looked at Reed and the look went through him. "But you already know one of my names, son. You have been carrying it around since you were 9 years old. You just do not know that you know it." Reed's breath fogged and tore away in the wind. "You taught my father to shoot," he said. Something crossed the old man's face, and it was terrible to watch, because it was joy and it was agony in the same instant, the way a wound reopens. "Danny Sutton," the old man said softly, and the name landed in the snow between them like a body. "Yes, I taught your father. Everything he knew about wind, about drop, about how you do not shoot the man, you shoot the future and send the round to meet him. I taught him that lying in the grass on a firing line a long way from here, when he was younger than you are now, and he taught it to you, and this morning I watched you recognize it on the east wall, and I knew you had finally come close enough to the truth to be in danger from it." He paused. "There is not much time, Captain, so I am going to tell you the thing I have been keeping for 25 years, and then you are going to have to be very strong." And there in the falling snow, with the storm closing the mountain and the enemy already moving in the dark, the old man told him. 25 years ago, he said, there was a team, 7 of us, special operations, the kind that does not get a parade and does not get a headstone with the truth on it. We were sent into a bad piece of country to do a job, and the job was a lie. The intelligence was a lie. We were told we were going after a weapons cache. We found one, all right, but the weapons in it were not the enemy's. They were ours. American ordnance, good long-range rifles and match ammunition, the exact things a certain kind of man can sell to a certain kind of buyer for the exact kind of money that changes a life. We had walked into the middle of somebody's business. The old man's jaw worked. We reported it up the chain, he said, the way you are supposed to. The way your sergeant reported her discrepancy 3 days ago. And 48 hours later the same chain that we trusted sent us into a gorge that had only one way in, and told us to hold. And then it went quiet, and the enemy came. And the enemy knew exactly where we were, and exactly how many we were, and exactly when we would be there. Because somebody had sold them the same way they sold the rifles. We were not ambushed, Captain. We were delivered. Reed could not speak. 6 of them died in that gorge, the old man said. I was the 7th. I lived because your father put himself between me and a gun, and took the rounds that were meant for me, and went down in the rocks with his hand in my collar. And your father, dying with his blood freezing on my hands the way your weapons sergeant's blood froze this morning, your father used the last air in his body to say 4 words to me. He did not ask me to avenge him. He did not ask me to clear his name. He looked at me and he said, look after my boy. The snow came down and down. Reed's face was wet, and he did not know when that had happened. You were 9, the old man said, and I made your father a promise with him bleeding out under my hands, and I have kept it every single day since. I could not do it in the open. The men who delivered us had too much reach, and I was a dead man on paper, a name on an accident board, and a dead man cannot file a report or hire a lawyer or hug a boy at a graduation. So I did the only thing a dead man can do. I stood the watch. I have been at the edge of every hard thing in your life that you never saw. And when I learned, 6 months ago, that your detachment was being routed to a range where certain numbers were not adding up, and I saw whose name was attached to the contract, I understood that the same machine that ate your father 25 years ago was reaching out for his son. So I came. I did not come by accident, Reed. I have never once been anywhere in your life by accident. Reed Sutton stood in the snow and shook, and it was not from the cold. Who, he said. His voice broke on the single word, and he made himself say it again. Who delivered you? Who sold my father? And the old man looked past Reed, back toward the warm-lit windows of the cantonment, back toward one window in particular, and his pale eyes went to something beyond hatred, something quiet and final. He was a lieutenant then, the old man said, young, ambitious, the kind of officer who understands early that a war is just a market if you are willing to be the coldest man in the room. He is the one who moved the rifles. He is the one who sold our position to close the gap in his own paperwork, exactly the way somebody tried to close your sergeant's report this morning. He got promoted on our graves, and he never stopped. He got very good at it. He learned that the safest place in the world to make a man disappear is a training range, because a range is already a place where soldiers die, and no one asks too many questions. He has done it more than once in 25 years. This morning was just the most recent time. Reed already knew. Somewhere in the last minute his body had already known, and the knowing was a stone going down a well with no bottom. The silver-haired man, Reed said, the observer, the one who struck the report. Coleman Ordway, the old man said, and saying the name seemed to cost him something he had been saving for a long time. He was a lieutenant when he sold your father. He is a retired colonel now, and a vice president of a company that sells the government the same rifles he has been stealing for a lifetime. And he is standing 400 meters from us in a warm room deciding how to kill you before the roads open. The storm howled down off the peaks, and somewhere out in that howling white, unseen, unheard, a second shape had been moving toward them for the last 90 seconds, low and patient and expert, and neither the young captain drowning in the truth nor the old man giving it to him had yet felt the weight of the scope that had just found them. Royce Talon had not slept either. He had spent the hours since the gorge in a state he did not have a name for, because, in 20 years of doing this work, he had never once failed to find a shooter he went looking for, and the ghost on the east wall had beaten him without ever showing himself. Talon had walked that firing position after the response cleared. He had knelt in the fold of granite and found nothing, no track, no brass but the one the captain took, and he had crouched there in the wind feeling something he had not felt since he was very young, which was smallness. Somewhere out there was a man who was better than he was, older than he was, and Royce Talon discovered that he needed to see that man's face more than he needed the money, more than he needed anything. And when Ordway called him in the dark and told him the ghost had surfaced near the tree line, Talon had gone out into the storm almost gladly. And there was the other thing, the thing Talon never spoke of, the thing that had ridden in the back of him for years. A long time ago, on a bad night in a worse place, Royce Talon had been dead to rights in another man's crosshairs, exposed, finished, and the shot had not come. He had never understood it. A shooter that good does not miss and does not hesitate, and yet the round had never arrived, and Talon had lived, and he had spent years telling himself it was luck, and he had never once believed it. Someone had chosen to let him walk. Someone had held a life in his hands and given it back. Talon did not know who. But lying now in the snow with his scope settled on two figures at the edge of the pines, watching the old gray man talk to the young captain, watching the way the old man held his stillness, a cold suspicion began to move in Royce Talon that he did not want to look at directly. He pushed it down. He had a contract. He settled the reticle on the old man's chest, read the wind the way he had been taught, and began his squeeze. Reed never saw it. The old man did. Some sense honed past explanation over a lifetime of being hunted made Warden move a fraction of a second before the rifle spoke. A hard shove that put Reed into the snow and turned the old man's own body just enough. And then the crack rolled across the cantonment, and the round that should have gone through the center of Deacon Beckett went through the meat of his shoulder instead and spun him down into the white. Reed came up screaming a warning that the wind ate. He grabbed for the old man. Beckett was already moving, dragging himself behind the nearest cover with his rifle still in his fist and a black stain spreading fast across the shoulder of his white gear. And his face in the snow light was gray and calm and utterly without fear. The face of a man who had been shot before and understood exactly what it was and exactly how much time it gave him. "Stay down," Beckett rasped. "He is up the slope 200 meters in the rocks. He is very good." More rounds walked in, methodical, searching, chewing the snow and the frozen ground, and Reed pressed himself flat and understood that the second accident had begun, right on schedule, and that out there in the storm was a shooter the mirror of the one bleeding beside him, and that this was no longer 25 years old. This was now. This was tonight, and it was going to be settled on this mountain one way or the other. Beckett got a hand inside his gear and came out with a small, hard radio, an old military handset, scarred and taped, and he keyed it with two red fingers, and Reed realized the old man had known the frequency all along, had carried it for years, had been waiting a very long time to say what he was about to say. Beckett lifted the handset to his mouth. Blood ran down his wrist and froze. His pale eyes found the warm lit window across the cantonment, the one window, and held it. "I never left Coleman," he said. Then he let the handset fall in the snow, still keyed, still open, so the man in the warm room would have to hear the wind, and he worked the bolt of his rifle one-handed, and he began, with a shattered shoulder and a storm at his back and a killer walking rounds toward him through the dark, to rise. The old man rose out of the snow with a ruined shoulder and a rifle in one hand, and 200 meters up the black slope, Royce Talon watched him do it and forgot how to breathe. A man that age with a round through him does not stand. That is the arithmetic. Talon had put people down with less and watched them stay down forever. And yet here was the gray ghost of Gallows Reach hauling himself upright in the teeth of the storm, calm, unhurried, working a bolt he had no business working. And Talon lay behind his scope with his finger on the trigger and could not finish the squeeze, because something in the way the old man moved had reached back across 20 years and taken hold of him. He had seen that stillness before. On a bad night in a worse country a lifetime ago, Royce Talon had been dead to rights in another man's crosshairs, silhouetted, careless, finished, and the round had never come. He had spent 2 decades telling himself it was luck. He had never believed it. Someone had held his whole life in the crook of a finger and had chosen, for no reason Talon could ever name, to give it back. And now, watching the old man rise, watching him read the wind by the lean of the falling snow, and settle that impossible calm over a battlefield the way a hand settles over a frightened animal, Royce Talon finally understood, all at once, whose mercy he had been carrying around inside him for 20 years like a stone he could not swallow and could not spit out. His earpiece crackled, Ordway's voice flat and cold and very close. "Finish him, Talon. That is what I pay you for." Talon did not answer. Down the slope the old man stood in the open, exposed, spending himself as bait so the young captain could crawl to cover, and Talon's crosshair rested on the center of that ash-gray beard, and the whole of his professional life told him to press, and he did not press. "Finish him," Ordway said again, and now there was something under the cold, something Talon had never heard in that voice in all the years he had worked for it. There was fear. Reed Sutton, flat in the snow, saw the old man standing when he should have been dying, and he did the only thing a soldier can do for the man who saved his father. He got up too. He put his own body into the open beside Beckett, filthy and unarmed and furious, and he faced the black slope where the killer lay, and he did not flinch, and something about that, a son standing in the storm exactly the way his father had once stood, went through Royce Talon like a blade. He took his finger off the trigger. "You do it yourself, Coleman," Talon said into the net. Then he lifted his rifle off the 2 figures in the snow, and he began slowly to move. In the range control annex, a woman in a safety vest was already running. Marlowe Quist had spent 4 months at Blackburn learning to be furniture. She had reconciled the same crooked numbers Camilla Ortega had reconciled, only she had done it with a badge in her boot, and a chain of authority behind her that reached a great deal higher than a range control desk. And she had come to Montana to build a case against a defense contractor who had been bleeding match-grade ordnance out of American ranges for longer than most of the soldiers guarding them had been alive. She had needed 1 more month. She had needed the paper to close. And then a graded exercise had turned into a massacre in Gallows Reach, and Marlowe Quist had understood, watching the tarps go down over the dead, that the man she was hunting had just decided to stop being patient. She had watched Coleman Ordway make a phone call about the weather. She had seen a discrepancy report vanish out of a secure channel in the middle of the night. And now the range seismic monitors were showing her something that turned her blood to ice water, a pattern of buried readings out along the demolition ranges, the signature of command charges being armed under 2 feet of fresh snow, staged along the exact draw where 10 exhausted survivors had been bedded down to rest. He was going to bury them, all of them. One more terrible accident on a mountain closed by a storm, a live fire range and a demolition mishap and grieving families and a closed casket board. The same story he had been telling for 25 years. And by the time the roads reopened, there would be nothing left in that draw but scorched snow, and a tragedy no one would ever be allowed to investigate. Quist keyed a radio that was not a range radio, and spoke fast to people who were still 40 minutes out through the storm. And then she went looking for the one man on that mountain who might be able to stop a detonation she could not reach. She found him in the range control bunker, and he was already there, and he was weeping. He was an old man, 63 years old, a retired command sergeant major named Merle Poole, and for 8 years he had been the graybeard of Blackburn, the senior evaluator, the man who had walked every range on that mountain 10,000 times and knew where every wire was buried because he had helped bury half of them. Quist had cleared him early and dismissed him, a harmless old cadreman running out his days on a training range. She had been wrong about him in a way she was only now beginning to understand, because Merle Poole was standing at the master firing panel with his hands flat on the cold steel and tears running into his white mustache, and he was talking to himself, and what he was saying was a name. Danny Sutton, he was saying, Danny Sutton. Oh God, not the boy too. Quist stopped in the doorway. You knew, she said. Merle Poole turned, and his ruined face told her everything before his mouth did. I was a sergeant, he said, 25 years ago, young, scared. There was a colonel, a lieutenant then, name of Ordway, and there was a team that died in a gorge, and there was an order, and the order was that I was going to type up an accident report that said those men died in a training mishap. He was shaking, and I typed it. I sat at a machine, and I turned 6 murdered soldiers into an accident because a man with rank and a cold smile told me my career and maybe my life depended on it. And I have carried those 6 men on my back every single day since, and I never once had the courage to set them down. He looked at the panel under his hands. But I kept the record, he said, the real one, the original firing desk logs from that night, the ones that show the range was cold, that show there was no live fire scheduled, that show those men could not have died the way my report said they died. I have kept them locked in a box for 25 years because I could not use them and I could not burn them. He looked up at Quist, and something had changed in the old man's eyes. Something had finally, after a lifetime, stood up. And now that same devil is out there arming charges under sleeping boys, and one of those boys is Danny Sutton's son. Quist crossed the bunker in 3 strides. Can you stop it, she said. Merle Poole put his hand on an old panel that predated every computer in the building, a hard-wired master cutoff from a generation of ranges that trusted copper and relays over software, a physical break in the demolition initiation circuit that no keyboard in the world could override. I can cut the master, Poole said. It will kill every remote initiator on this mountain. He swallowed, but it will not reach a forward firing point. If he has a hand initiator out at the demolition control bunker, out on the far side of the basin, he can close that circuit himself and I cannot stop him from here. Nobody can stop him from there except a bullet, and the range across that basin is 2,000 meters through a whiteout, and there is not a man alive who can make that shot in this. Marlowe Quist thought of the old gray ghost standing wounded in the snow. There might be one, she said. Out in the storm, the pieces came together the way iron filings come together over a hidden magnet. Reed got Beckett behind the concrete of the arms room and Ortega was there, and Doc Ramsey, and Vic Delgado with a rifle he had finally been allowed to load, and young Jonah Teague white-faced and steady, and the survivors of Gallows Reach formed up around the wounded old man in the falling snow the way A squad forms up around a fallen brother, because that is the only thing soldiers know how to do. Beckett was gray now, gray as his beard, and the snow under his shoulder was black, and Ramsey worked on him fast and cursing, and Beckett let him. And Beckett's pale eyes went out across the basin to the far dark shape of the demolition control bunker, 2,000 meters through the white, where a single warm point of light had just come on. "He is out there," Beckett said. "He gave up on burying you quiet. Now he is going to do it loud. He is going to close the circuit himself." "Then we stop him," Reed said. "You do not have time to cross that basin," Beckett said. "No one does." He looked at the far light, and then he looked down at the long rifle across his knees, the Mark 22, the round that could reach past a mile and arrive with murder still in it. And then he looked at his own right shoulder, shattered, useless, the arm that had made 10,000 shots hanging dead at his side. And for the first time all night, something in the old man's face broke. "I cannot make it," he said quietly. "God help me, I have made that shot 100 times and I cannot make it now. I cannot run the bolt. I cannot hold." He looked at Reed, and 25 years of grief were in it. "I got here in time and I still cannot reach him." The storm screamed. The warm light in the far bunker steadied. And Reed Sutton looked at the rifle and looked at the man who had taught his father, and heard his father's voice come up out of a green notebook in 25 years of silence, low and patient on a cold morning. "You do not shoot the man, son. You shoot the future." "Talk me onto it," Reed said. He took the rifle out of the old man's dead hands. He went down behind it in the snow, into the position his father had first folded him into when he was 8 years old, cheek to the stock, both eyes open, and the whole crushing weight of everything he had learned that night settled onto his shoulders and became, suddenly, very simple. Merle Poole's voice broke over the open net from the range control bunker, ragged with tears and something like hope. "Cutting the master now," Poole said. "Every remote is dead. He has to hand initiate. It has to be the forward bunker. Son, whoever you are, that man murdered better men than either of us, and I helped him do it, and I am begging you, do not let him do it again." The remote initiators died all across the mountain. And Coleman Ordway, out in the demolition control bunker with the storm clawing at the door, looked down at a firing panel that had just gone dark, and understood that somewhere behind him an old ghost had finally found the nerve, and he did the only thing a man like Coleman Ordway has ever known how to do. He reached for the hand initiator, the physical one, the copper and the brass, and he began to close the circuit himself. And out in the snow between the shooter and his target, a dying man read the wind. Royce Talon had not gone toward Ordway to save anyone. He had gone because 20 years of a debt he never understood had finally come due, and a man cannot outrun that, not in any country, not at any range. He reached the forward bunker as Ordway was reaching for the initiator, and he put himself in the door, and he said one word, "No," and Coleman Ordway, without hesitation, without so much as a change in his cold gray face, drew a pistol and shot the man who had done his killing for 20 years, and Royce Talon went down in the snow with the storm coming in the open door. But Talon did not die right away. Dying men do strange and enormous things, and what Royce Talon did, lying broken in the snow of a range at the end of the world, was key his radio one last time, and read the wind the way the finest shooters read it, the way the old man on the far side of the basin had read it his whole life, because Talon understood at last that the only thing worth doing with the skill that had damned him was to give it, in his last breath, to the ghost who had once let him live. Left to right, Talon said into the net, his voice a wet whisper under the storm, "Full value, 11, maybe 12. The basin funnels it. He gets slower near the far wall. His breath rattled. Hold left, old man. Hold hard left and send it." In the snow beside Reed, Deacon Beckett went utterly still, because he knew that voice, and he knew what it was doing, and he knew what it cost. "Read," Beckett said, low and steady. All the grief burned out of him now, only the teaching left, the same teaching in the same voice that had lived in a green notebook for 25 years. "You heard him. Full value left. This wind will lie to you at the far wall. It always lies at the wall, so you trust the call and not your eye. Do not aim at the man." He put his good hand flat on his son's shoulder. "You send the round to meet him where he has not gotten to yet." Reed Sutton breathed out half a breath and did not finish it. Everything that was ever going to matter had narrowed to a single point of warm light 2,000 meters across a screaming basin. A man reaching for a switch that would bury 10 sleeping soldiers under a mountain. The same man who had reached for the same kind of switch 25 years ago and buried Reed's father. And now the future stood in front of that man in the shape of a bullet. And Reed, held hard, left the way. A dead enemy had told him to, and he thought of his father, and he sent it. The rifle came back into his shoulder, like the closing of a door on the whole of the past. The round crossed 2,000 meters of storm in a little under 3 seconds, and no computer had solved it, and no drone had lit it, and no piece of technology on that entire mountain had touched it. Only the wind, read by 2 dying masters, and passed into the hands of a boy who had been raised on it without ever knowing why. And it arrived at the warm light exactly where the future was. And it took Coleman Ordway through the reaching arm, and slammed him off the initiator and into the back wall of the bunker, a half-second before his fingers closed the circuit. A half-second. The exact half-second that a younger Deacon Beckett had been late by, 25 years ago, in another gorge, with another switch and another team. The debt of that half-second had been the interest on his whole ruined life. And out in the Montana snow, an old man lay beside his best friend's son and watched the warm light go out across the basin, watched the detonation that never came, and made a sound that was not quite a word, and covered his face with his one good hand. They took Coleman Ordway alive. The men Marlowe Quist had called came grinding up the mountain as the storm began to break near dawn, and they found the retired colonel bleeding in a demolition bunker with his hand ruined and his empire ending. And they found a range control graybeard named Merle Poole waiting for them with a locked box 25 years old, and a confession he had been rehearsing his whole life. They found seismic records of charges armed against sleeping soldiers, and a deleted discrepancy report recovered from a place Ordway did not know it had been copied, and a paper trail of match-grade ordnance that led out of American ranges and into the hands of men who should never have had it. And at the bottom of all of it, holding it together like a rusted nail, the name of a lieutenant who had learned young that a war is only a market to the coldest man in the room. And they found in Poole's box the truth about a gorge 25 years gone, 6 names, a team that had not died in any training accident, men who had reported a crime and been delivered to their killers for it, and whose families had been handed a lie in a closed casket. The record came open at last. The dead got their names back. And among them, exonerated 25 years too late and not 1 minute too soon, was a spotter, a husband, a father, a man who had used his final breath to say 4 words about his boy. Sergeant First Class Daniel Sutton, killed in action, killed keeping a man alive so that man could keep a promise. Reed Sutton read his father's true record standing up, because he could not do it any other way. The mountain reopened 3 days later. There was an accounting, the kind that happens behind heavy doors, and there were men in good suits who arrived to make certain the thing was contained. And there was, Marlowe Quist warned Reed quietly before she left, a name above Ordway that none of the paper quite touched, a patron, a hand that had greased 40 years of it, and that was already, even now, going very still and very quiet somewhere far from any range. And there was a second mountain, another range in another state, where the seismic monitors had been showing the same buried signature for months, and where the work, whatever the work was, had not yet stopped. But that was tomorrow's watch. This morning, on a firing line at Blackpen with the sun finally out and the snow blinding and clean, there were only the living, and the things the living owe the dead. They had patched the old man up enough to move, and enough to argue, and Doc Ramsey had lost the argument about the hospital, because you do not make a ghost do anything a ghost does not intend to do. Beckett stood on the firing line with his arm bound across his chest, and his ash-gray beard bright in the hard mountain light, and he held two things, and he gave them away. The first he gave to Reed. It was a rifle, an old bolt gun, an M24, worn and cared for, 25 years out of the light. The rifle a young spotter named Danny Sutton had carried into a gorge and never carried out, recovered and kept and restored across a lifetime by the only man who had known what it was. Beckett put it into the son's hands the way you put something sacred into the world. He would want you to have the tool, Beckett said, but the notebook was always yours. You have been shooting his wind since you were 8 years old and you never knew it. He held Reed's eyes. Now you know. The second thing he gave to the youngest man there. Jonah Teague, the sniper student, the boy who had asked in a plywood barracks who saves 12 strangers and just walks away, stood at attention when the old man came to him, because he did not know what else to do with the size of the moment. Beckett looked at him for a long time. Then he took from his pocket a worn challenge coin, old, the edges smoothed by decades of handling, 4 words cut into the back of it by hand a long time ago, and he pressed it into the boy's palm and closed the young fingers around it. Somebody stood a watch over all of you last night, Beckett said. His voice was low and even, quiet enough that the boy had to lean in to hold every word. And somebody stood one over me, 25 years ago, and I have been paying it forward ever since, because that is the only kind of debt worth carrying. He tapped the coin in the boy's fist. There is always somebody pinned down in a gorge, son. Always. And there is never enough of us who will lie in the cold, and the wet and the dark for people who will never know our names. Jonah Teague opened his hand and read the 4 words. The watch still holds. You hold the watch now, Beckett said. And then the old man did the thing he had done his whole life, the thing he had done in every hard hour of Reed Sutton's life, without Reed ever seeing it. He turned and he walked toward the tree line, unhurried, a wounded old ghost with a bound arm and a long rifle slung across his back, and the high pines took him in the way they take a shadow. And by the time Reed understood that goodbye had already happened, there was nothing there but snow and light and the enormous silence of the mountains. Reed Sutton stood on the firing line with his father's rifle in his hands. Then he lifted an old scarred radio handset, the one Beckett had left in the snow, still keyed to a frequency the old man had carried for 25 years, and he pressed it, and he did not entirely know what he meant to say, only that a thing this large should not pass without a word. Warden, he said. Static answered him. Wind and distance and the long white silence of the high country, and under it, or maybe only in the wanting of it, something that might have been a carrier tone and might have been nothing at all. He lowered the handset. Out past the tree line, the mountains went up and up into a country too big and too cold and too indifferent to hold any one man for long, and somewhere in it, he knew, the old man was already moving, already turning that pale gray eye toward the next range and the next gorge, and the next pinned-down soul who would never learn who had lain in the dark for them. The dead had their names, the living had their promise, and the watch, wherever the old man carried it now, still held. Where is he now? Jonah Teague asked quietly, the coin warm in his fist. Reed Sutton looked at the empty tree line for a long time. Out there, he said, standing the watch. And then he shouldered his father's rifle and turned his own eyes toward the mountains and began, at last, to understand the shape of the thing he had been born into and the length of the watch still to come.